Hi, this is John Farrell with clothesguru.com, and in this tutorial we are going to learn how to make this image called white linen. This image is an image I made for the header of my website, clothesguru.com, and you'll notice I broke it up into pieces so that I could use it as a parallax background. And so this is the image we're going to make. For this tutorial, you will need a couple pieces of software. You'll need Marvelous Designer, and you will need Blender. And you can get both of these off the internet. You can download Marvelous Designer from marvelousdesigner.com. You can get a 15-day free trial there if you want to just try it out, or you can purchase it from any of their purchase plans. And Blender you can get from blender.org, and it is open source, available to you free of charge. You can use any other 3D modeling package you want. This particular tutorial will focus on Blender though. So here are the parts of the tutorial we're going to go over in part 1, and I'm going to try and move fairly quickly through these. I tend to be long-winded. I've recorded this tutorial several times already, and it's been way too long. So if I move a little quickly, I apologize. This is an intermediate tutorial, so if some parts of it are not clear, I suggest that you go back to the beginner tutorials and go ahead and take a look at those to get caught up to speed. So we are going to do a lot of modeling in part 1. We're going to model the colliders. We're going to export those and bring them into Marvelous Designer, where we will model the cloth and then export it again back to Blender. So let's go ahead and jump into Blender. So this is what my finished tutorial scene looks like. Here you can see all the pieces lined up through the camera view. I have my front layer here that has the butterfly on the front piece of cloth. I've got the second clothesline layer here, and then the third clothesline layer here. You can see how I've stacked them in 3D space to create an interesting composition through the camera view. So the first thing we need to do is we need to model these clotheslines. Let's go ahead and jump over to an empty layer in Blender. And if you're not familiar with Blender, I would suggest going through some introductory tutorials to Blender. You can find many of those off of blender.org, or a nice site like blenderguru.com, for example. But let's go ahead and we'll quickly create this clothesline. So we're going to use a cube here. I created that cube. It's created it way over here where I had my 3D cursor. I'm just going to bring it back to my origin. So there it is at my origin. And what we're going to do is we're going to scale this cube, go to edit mode, and we're going to hit S for scale, X to constrain it along the X-axis. And I'm going to do that again until I've got a nice long rectangle here. So now that I have that long rectangle, here in my tools section I'm going to choose loop, cut, and slide, and I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel to create a whole bunch of loops along this, and then I'll click. I don't need to slide these, it lets you slide them by default, so I'm just going to right click to leave them where they're at. If I want to make any changes to this, I can still do that right here. But let's go ahead and leave it as is. I'm going to hit the A key to deselect this. I'm going to hide my two sidebar menus here, and I'm going to go into the front ortho view, and I'm going to select my center edges. Now I'm going to activate proportional editing from right here. The hotkey to do that is O, and I'm going to hit the G key to move. And you'll notice with proportional editing, I scroll my scroll wheel and I have this region of influence around this point that I have selected, and I can grow that or I can shrink it in the proportional editing. So I want to move this only along the Z axis. So by hitting Z, I can constrain it. And now I'm going to head and grow my proportional editing tool until I have a nice bowed clothesline here, just like so. And that looks really nice. That's exactly what I want it to look like. So I'm noticing that this clothesline is actually a little thick right now. I'm going to scale it down. So I'm just going to do that really quickly by selecting all the pieces with A, hitting X, and or S, and I'm going to hit Y to scale it along the Y axis. and hit S again and scale it along the Z axis. You'll notice that actually, let's do a little more along Z. You'll notice that actually changes how drooped my clothesline is. I can go ahead and I can alter that again if I come back in here to my proportional editing, and I can get it drooped again kind of the way I want it. So now I have my clothesline, but it's just a cube. So what we want to do is we're going to go into our modifier tools and we're going to add a modifier, and it's going to be a subdivision surface modifier. And let's go ahead and show both of our subdivision surfaces. We have two levels of subdivision surface in our render. I want to see both of those in the viewport, so I'm going to hit 2 there. And now this looks nice and smooth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually apply this, and that will add that geometry into the model. Now I have a nice smooth clothesline, and I'm ready to export this to Marvelous Designer. So go ahead and do this several times to create all 3 of your clotheslines. And you can export these one at a time, or you can export them all at once. I'm going to export them all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and select these, and I'm going to go to File, Export, OBJ. Now if for some reason you do not have this in your export menu, you need to make sure that in your user preferences you have this export add-on turned on. So if you go to the add-ons section, and let's set this back to default. If I click on Import Export and I type in OBJ here, you need to make sure this is checked on. So once that is checked on, you can come up here and you can say File, Export, OBJ, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just export this. I'm going to say Temp OBJ. I'm going to make sure selection is turned on because I have a lot of other meshes in my scene. I only want to export what's selected. You also want to make sure Right Normals is turned on. And I'm going to scale this export by 100 because it will make sure that the avatar is big enough in Marvelous Designer. And then I'm going to hit Export OBJ. Now let's jump on over to Marvelous Designer. So it'll probably look like this. If you want to clear that avatar, go ahead and come up to Clear Avatars. And once again, you can just get rid of the garment by clicking Delete. Make sure your sync button is turned on. So you've got everything nice and clean. So let's come up here to File, Import, and we're going to choose OBJ. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose my temp OBJ, which I've exported from Blender. I'm going to import my OBJ here at 100%, and I'm going to hit OK. So here's my clothesline pieces. So now that I have these clothesline pieces here in Marvelous Designer, we're going to go ahead and we're going to drape some cloth on them. Let's start by just draping a sheet. So I'll come up here to my rectangle tool, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw out a rectangle in my 2D viewport. And there we go. There I have my sheet. So one thing to make sure of here in Marvelous Designer is that, oh no, Marvelous Designer has decided to quit on me. Look at that. Hard crash. Well, that is not good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pause, and I'll start this up when I reload Marvelous Designer. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm back. I've launched Marvelous Designer again, and I've noticed it says that an auto file or an autosave file exists. Do I want to recover that? Let's go ahead and try this and see what it does. Well, that wasn't all that helpful. Let's go ahead and clear this, and let's go ahead and bring back in our clothesline. So Marvelous Designer, as good of a program as it is, it does crash quite a bit. And I'm not sure if that's version 4 or what's going on there. I've used version 2, 3, and 4. 4 seems to be the most unstable, honestly, but it's obviously something they're continuing to work on. Hopefully they'll improve it, get rid of some of those crashes. So let's go ahead and create our sheet again in the 3D view, and here it is. I've put it here in the 3D viewport. Now let's go ahead and drape this over our front clothesline. So I'm going to translate it over there with my gizmo. And one thing that you really want to make sure of is you want to make sure that the normals are facing out when we drape this piece of cloth on the clothesline. The reason being is we want them to face out for the shading. when we go ahead and we shade and texture this in Blender. We can easily flip the normals in Blender, but it's just better to have them right from the get-go. So it's kind of hard to tell by looking in the shaded view at which side is actually which way the normals are facing. It's actually this side that is darker, where the normals are not facing. They're facing this way. It can be really hard to tell if you can't notice the difference in those two tones. So there's a better way to actually find out which way the normals are facing. You can go ahead and hit Alt-4, which activates your mesh view, and the normals are facing the direction that displays the tessellation. So if I spin around here, you'll notice now I can't see anything from this side. That means the normals are facing this way. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I rotate this so that when it falls on the clothesline, the normals are facing out, just like so. So I'll go back to shaded view. So now that I have this cloth hovering over my clothesline, I can go ahead and I can press the simulate button. And our cloth falls down there onto our clothesline. So you'll notice right off the bat we have some problems. This didn't simulate very well. It didn't collide very well with our clothesline. And that's because the clothesline is actually a very thin piece of geometry. And our mesh here, the triangles of this mesh are fairly large compared to where the vertice placement is on this clothesline. So we get a lot of edges that tend to fall through. So there are two ways to fix this. The first thing we could do, we can lift this up a little bit so it's not going through the clothesline anymore. And we could up the resolution. I could put this up to something like a particle distance of 10, for example. And if I hit the simulate button again, you'll notice it'll fall back on the clothesline. And now it's not falling through anymore because I have enough vertices, I have enough resolution that all of that is captured and it's able to stay on top of the clothesline. The problem with this is to sim this is very slow. Like if I pull this cloth out and if I try and manipulate it and things, it's just really slow. It's really kind of lagging. Even on, a pretty high-end machine. My machine's not screaming fast, but it is a quad-core processor, and I have 10 gigs of RAM. I need to upgrade. I can go up to 16, but anyway, that's beside the point. The gist of it is I have a pretty fast machine, but this is still a pretty slow simulation because we have a lot of vertices simming. So a better way to fix this, instead of upping the resolution, let's go ahead and put this back to its default of 20. And we'll go ahead and leave it at 20, and you'll notice we get the same problem again. We get it all poking through. But what we can do is we can come here to our sim preferences and our sim properties, and we can turn this from normal to complete in the sim quality. And you'll notice immediately it starts to kind of jump around and try and do some things. Let's go ahead and turn off the simulation and lift this up a little bit, and we'll let it fall again. So you'll notice off the bat we are getting a much better result. It's still not perfect. And actually here it's starting to fall through again. But we're getting a much better result than we were originally. There we go. So now it's all sitting on top of the clothesline. So notice there's a big offset here, and that big offset is actually a problem. What that is it's basically the offset on our avatar. We can change that by selecting our clothesline here and going to Scene and selecting the top level avatar tag here. And here we can change the skin offset for our collider. So I'm going to change this to something much lower, like say 0.1. And you'll notice it falls, so it's much closer to actually being on the collider here. So now, even though that I've turned this up to complete, our resolution is unfortunately still a little too low. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to up this to maybe 15. And I'm going to raise it up again and drop it one more time on my collider. Looks like it's getting a little bit stuck here. So I'm going to try and pull it off. There we go, much better. Okay, this is looking a lot better. We could increase our collider offset just a little bit so it wasn't falling through as much, but this is actually pretty good here. So it's kind of a balancing act. You're balancing your sim time with your resolution. And for this sheet, it really doesn't matter. We could go to something that's a pretty high resolution, and we could sim this sheet now, with our default of 10, and we would get a pretty good result. Let's up that offset just a tiny, tiny bit on the avatar. Let's say something like 0.3. That should be plenty to actually keep it from going through. Let's pull it up one more time, let it fall. No, it's still going through just a little bit. I'm going to up it just a little bit more, let's say 0.5. And that's looking good enough. These little areas where it's poking through, we can pull these out in Blender, or alternately, we can just turn off the sim and we can nudge this whole thing up just slightly. And now, not colliding. So when you actually export your piece of cloth, you'll want to export it at a resolution that makes sense for how it's going to be viewed. So in Blender, for example, I exported the front pieces of cloth at a much higher resolution than these back pieces of cloth. If I go ahead and tab into the edit mode here, you'll see what the resolution looks like. And these look weird, by the way, because I have a solidify modifier on them. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but here's the resolution of that back sheet. And here we can see the resolution of this front sheet. If I come up here, tab into this, you'll notice it's really high because I wanted a lot more detail in that front sheet. But for the back sheets that are going to be all blurred out, we don't need to export a ton of resolution. So a resolution like this would be more than enough. And we could even export it with it falling through in certain places and fix that after the fact. So I see we're about 9 minutes into our tutorial right now. Let's go ahead and quickly go over some basic patterning for our shirts, and then we will go ahead and look at exporting this. So let's create a quick shirt here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to really quickly draw out half of a shirt pattern. And I'm going to do that and draw out, for this particular tutorial, well, okay, let's go ahead and we'll do this right. I was going to make a pattern that is not very correct, but I'll go ahead and do one that is that's more correct. So we'll go ahead and we'll place these points. Let's line this up so it's more straight. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we will take this pattern, and I'm going to make a neckline here with the curve tool. I'm going to go ahead and make a sleeve hole here with the curve tool, and then I'm going to select my center line here, which actually is not all that lined up to be honest. Let's make this a little bit straighter. That's much better. We'll go ahead and select this center line, and we're going to unfold this to create our pattern here. I'll delete this vertex I don't need, and we'll go ahead and we're going to duplicate this, copy paste for the back, and then we'll go ahead and we'll quickly create some sleeves for this. So we'll go ahead and we'll quickly make a sleeve pattern. I'm just going to draw this out super quick here, like so. Let's bring that in. I'm being really quick here. I'm not being super accurate. I'd be much more accurate if we were actually doing something that we were going to be looking at close up. But we've got a basic sleeve pattern here that we'll unfold. Actually, I don't want this to be a long sleeve. I want this to be a short sleeve, so I'm going to I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull this out like this. Whoops. Let's go ahead and pull this out like this. And we're going to delete this center fold here. So here's our sleeve pattern. So let's go ahead and sew these together really fast. Here in the 3D view, if you didn't know, you can hit the F key, and the F key will go ahead and focus on what you have selected. It does this weird transition animation, which is really annoying. It doesn't do that in the Enterprise version, which I used to use at work, but it does for some reason in the personal version, which is incredibly annoying. I'm going to flip this around so the normals are facing the right way, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew these pieces together. So let's go over to our sewing tools. Let's pull this out so we can see them. I'll use my segment sewing tool, sew these pieces together, and we'll go ahead and we will sew our shoulders together as well. And it looks like we're all good here. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew our sleeve in as well. So let's look at this here. So which one's my front and which one's my back? This is my front. Okay. So let's go ahead and sew this in here. And here's my back. Let's make sure we sew this over to here. We'll bring our sleeve down so he's not up so high, and we'll turn him around. Oops. Like so. Move it over, up. It looks like I've actually sewn this incorrectly. I've flipped some of these seams. So let's go ahead and flip them around. We'll reverse the sewing on this guy. And that looks good. So there is that sleeve, and let's go ahead and let's copy it and we'll paste it for the other side, and then we'll go ahead and we will sew it to the other side. So let's go ahead and we'll sew this guy to here. Let's bring this sleeve over so we can see him up close. And we'll go ahead and we'll sew the opposite side to here, just like so. So there we go. We have our sleeves, and everything's all ready to sew together. The only thing we haven't done is finished sewing the sleeves together. So what I'm going to do so this doesn't fall to the floor is I'm going to place a pin. I'm going to put a pin here and a pin here, a pin here and a pin here, and then we'll go ahead and we'll hit the simulate button. We'll watch as that comes together, and we get this. I'm going to stop the drape here and just go into regular simulate mode. We'll go ahead and let it relax for a moment. You'll notice we have this amazing looking shirt here. My super fast and furious shirt. So let's go ahead and finish sewing the sleeves together here. Sew the two sides together. And there's my shirt. It's wow, it's something else, isn't it? Looks pretty fantastic. So I'm going to quickly throw a cotton preset on this shirt. Let's go ahead and select all the pattern pieces. We'll put that fabric on there, and we'll let it simulate a little bit so we get more of a cottony feel. And the trick with these shirts and other clothing that we have hanging on the clothesline, they're not actually draped on the clothesline. All they're doing is they're just pinned. So what I would actually do is once I have them relatively simulated, I'll go ahead and I'll just transform them so that they're kind of sitting on the clothesline like that. And that's really all I would do to get these guys into place. So one thing to be aware of is right now I'm going through the floor here, and if I turn on simulate, it's going to start freaking out because this is going through the floor just like so. Let me edit undo that. Oh, not control tab. Let's edit undo. And what we're going to do is, instead of dealing with the floor, we're going to go ahead and just turn the floor off in our simulation properties. You can do that in here, going underground and turning off the ground collision. Now I can press simulate and it will actually sim and it won't care about the floor. So let your shirts or your other pieces of clothing simulate until you've got them looking the way you want them, and then you can go ahead and get ready to export them. So one thing I did while I was working in here and setting up all these pieces of clothing is I would go ahead and freeze particular pieces of clothing that I wasn't working with at the moment. And so that's a good way to get a lot of pieces of clothing in here at once and just export them all at once instead of exporting them one at a time. The last thing I want to go over is using elasticity to create a little more interest in your sheets. So the instance I want to look at here is this sheet that I'm using as my front sheet here in Blender. So what I've done is I've actually used elasticity along the edges of this sheet to create kind of this wrinkled, gathered look, as if this were an older sheet and was, had been through the wash a couple times. And so just to give it a little more realistic of a look, you'll notice I was actually kind of lazy. I was doing this as fast as I could. This isn't even one continuous sheet. It's two pieces of cloth that I've just kind of stacked together. I was working pretty quickly putting this together. If I were going back and doing it again, I would probably make that one single sheet instead of two sheets. But you'll notice what I did is I actually didn't drape this sheet over the clothesline because I wanted to get this nice kind of catenary curve here, this nice drape in the cloth. And so I just let it free hang from a couple of points in Marvelous Designer. But let's look quickly at how to do the elasticity trick. So I'm going to come here to my internal lines tool and I'm going to draw an internal line along this edge, and by holding shift I'm going to constrain it, and I'm going to double click, and I've created this internal line along this edge. So what I can now do is I can come in here and I can turn elastic on, and I'm going to set this to something like 95. A higher elastic ratio equals less elasticity. So that's something to be aware of, is that higher equals less. This is another one of these. Higher is, higher actually equals less elasticity. So if I turn this on now in the simulation, you'll notice I get this nice bunching look. So that's how I created that extra detail along the sheet edges here in Marvelous Designer. And once you've got something that you like, I did that along all of the edges. Once you've got something that you like, you can go ahead and you can export. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to come up here to File, and I'm going to say Export OBJ. Let's go ahead and say use the temp OBJ. I want to make sure I click off the avatar. I don't want to export my clothesline as part of this. And we're going to keep single object on, we're going to keep weld on, and we actually want to check on thick. I didn't do that when I first did this tutorial, but you want to actually do that, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then you want unified UV coordinates checked on, and I'm going to export this at 100% and just hit OK. Let's go back into Blender, and here I'll come to my File, Import menu, and I'll say Import Wavefront OBJ, Temp OBJ, and click Import. And you'll notice that the scale is completely off. So I didn't take much care to figure out the scaling when I did this tutorial initially, but what I can do here is I can actually just come in here and select my cloth and scale it by 0.01, and that will scale it to the correct size. You can see now it's the correct size here. I'll select the other piece, 0.01, and now it's the correct size. So one thing that you'll note Since I exported this with thickness, it actually exported multiple pieces for this garment, which is kind of annoying that it does that, but that is the case. But it has actually exported some thickness in this garment, which will become useful later. So that is basically it. That is how to model your clotheslines, take them into Marvelous Designer, build some basic clothing and some sheets, and then export those back into Blender. In the next tutorial, we'll go more into a couple other things we're going to do to the models, and then we'll start talking about shading and lighting and setting up the rest of the scene. Thanks for watching.